The hiking poles had belonged to my sister Sarah before she disappeared on the Appalachian Trail 3 years ago. The police investigation turned up nothing. Just her backpack near a trail marker, her journal entries becoming increasingly paranoid in the days before she vanished. The last entry mentioned someone following her, watching her from between the trees. The authorities dismissed it as altitude-induced paranoia, but I knew my sister. She wasn't the type to imagine things. When I finally decided to hike the same trail, I took her poles with me, hoping they might somehow help me understand what happened. I didn't expect them to actually guide me to the truth. The first few days on the trail were uneventful, marked only by the rhythmic click of the poles against rocky terrain and the occasional chirp of birds overhead. I'd done my research, filed my hiking plan with the rangers, installed multiple tracking apps on my phone, and even carried a satellite emergency beacon. The legal framework for missing persons in national parks was something I'd studied extensively since Sarah's disappearance. I knew the statistics, the procedures, and most importantly, the mistakes I couldn't afford to make. The rangers had assured me that this section of the trail was well monitored, with regular patrols and emergency stations every few miles. It started subtly on the 4th day. The feeling of being watched crept up slowly, like a shadow lengthening at sunset. At first, I dismissed it as hypervigilance, a natural response given what had happened to Sarah. My therapist had warned me about projection, about how trauma could manifest in unexpected ways. But there was something about the way the forest seemed to hold its breath when I passed, the way branches seemed to reach toward me when there was no wind. The hiking poles felt different in my hands, warmer somehow, as if they were trying to tell me something. The legal documents I'd studied hadn't prepared me for the psychological impact of actual stalking. Every snapped twig became a footstep, every shadow a potential threat. I began documenting everything, taking photos and videos, noting timestamps and GPS coordinates. If something happened to me, I wanted to leave a trail that investigators couldn't ignore. The rangers had explained the jurisdictional complexities of crimes committed in national parks, how they fell under federal authority, how evidence needed to be preserved, how witness statements needed to be corroborated. That night, I found the first marker. It wasn't on any of my maps. A crude symbol carved into a tree, reminiscent of the ancient trail markers Native Americans once used. But this was different, newer, and somehow familiar. Looking through Sarah's final photos on my phone, I found it. The same symbol, barely visible in the background of her last selfie. My hands trembled as I gripped her hiking poles, and for a moment, I swore I felt them pull me slightly to the left, toward an unmarked path I hadn't noticed before. The psychological literature on trauma bonding with objects took on new meaning as I followed the invisible trail the poles seemed to reveal. Every step felt guided, as if Sarah's memory wasn't just attached to the poles, it was actively working through them. I'd read cases of spirit attachment to personal items, but I'd always approached them with scholarly skepticism. Now, with each step deeper into the unmarked territory, that skepticism began to crumble. The legal protection orders I'd filed before the trip suddenly seemed inadequate. They were designed for human threats, for stalkers who could be identified and served with papers. But what do you do when the threat exists in the spaces between what's known and what's possible? The Forest Service regulations I'd memorized offered no guidance for what was happening. Each new symbol I found seemed to mock the very idea of legal framework and protection. The 8th day brought the discovery that changed everything. In a small clearing, well off the marked trail, I found a cave entrance partially hidden by vegetation. The symbols were everywhere here, carved with increasing urgency into the surrounding trees. My satellite phone showed no signal, and the GPS tracker was malfunctioning, showing coordinates that jumped erratically. The hiking poles grew almost hot in my hands, vibrating with what felt like recognition. Sarah's journal had mentioned dreams of a cave in her final entries, but the police had found no cave systems in their search area. I now understood why. They'd been looking in the wrong place, following marked trails and topographical maps. The real trail had been hidden, marked only for those who knew how to read the ancient symbols. Or perhaps for those who carried the right objects, objects that held memories and purposes beyond their mundane functions. The psychological impact of realizing you're being led somewhere by an inanimate object is difficult to describe. Part of my mind screamed that this was trauma-induced delusion, that I was following patterns that didn't exist. Another part recognized that Sarah had experienced the same thing, the same pull, the same guidance, the same inevitable journey toward whatever waited in that cave. The poles felt like extensions of her will now, warm and purposeful in my hands. Legal precedent offered no framework for what I found inside. The cave opened into a chamber that shouldn't have existed according to any geological survey. The walls were covered with the same symbols, but these were older, much older. Among them, I found Sarah's last message, not carved, but written in what looked like chalk. They've been here all along. The markers aren't for us. We're the markers. The psychological theory of shared delusions suggests that trauma can create parallel experiences among family members. But as I stood in that chamber, watching shadows move against laws of physics I'd trusted all my life, I knew this was something else. The hiking poles grew so hot I had to drop them, and they fell with purpose, pointing toward a passage that seemed to descend forever. Local law enforcement would later find my emergency beacon signal, but by then the cave would be gone, hidden again behind vegetation that seemed to grow overnight. The legal battle to force a proper investigation would consume years, complicated by jurisdictional issues and the lack of physical evidence. The hiking poles would be the only items recovered, found neatly placed at the original trail marker where Sarah's backpack had been discovered. The psychological impact of my experience defied traditional therapeutic approaches. How do you process trauma that exists outside the realm of accepted reality? The support groups for families of missing persons offered no comfort. Their stories, while tragic, followed familiar patterns. Mine belonged to a different category, one that the legal system wasn't designed to address. Experts in object attachment phenomena studied the hiking poles extensively. They found nothing unusual, just standard aluminum poles with worn grips and faded trail dust. But none of them tried to use them on the trail. None of them felt the warmth, the subtle pull toward places that shouldn't exist. The legal documents declaring Sarah officially dead after 7 years would never tell the real story. I've since learned that there are others, people who found similar markers, who felt the pull of ordinary objects transformed by extraordinary circumstances. We share our stories in hidden forums, away from the scrutiny of law enforcement and mental health professionals. The legal system may not recognize our experiences, but we know what we've found. More importantly, we know what found us. The psychological weight of carrying such knowledge changes you. You learn to see the world differently, to recognize the patterns hidden beneath official trail maps and legal documents. Sarah's hiking poles hang on my wall now, but sometimes late at night, I swear they turn slightly, pointing toward the mountains. I've learned that some mysteries don't need solving, they need witnessing. And some trails are meant to be marked on any official map. Today, I still hike, but never alone. The legal requirements for group expeditions provide a framework of safety, but more importantly, they provide witnesses. The psychological impact of that day in the cave hasn't diminished, but it's evolved into something like understanding. Sarah isn't missing anymore. At least, not in the way the legal system defines missing persons. She's become part of something older than our laws, older than our understanding of reality itself. Each year, more symbols appear on trees in national parks across the country. Rangers file reports, environmental scientists conduct studies, and lawyers draft new regulations to prevent vandalism. But those of us who know, who've carried objects that remember, recognize them for what they are, not markers of where to go, but warnings of where we've already been. The legal system may never acknowledge what really happens on those unmarked trails, but the poles remember. And sometimes, if you listen carefully, they try to tell their story. The psychological literature on trauma and memory suggests that we process extreme experiences by creating narratives that make sense within our existing worldview.
I never understood my father's obsession with that old red bandana until I found myself lost on the same mountain trail where he died. The park rangers had warned me about hiking alone, quoting statistics and regulations about solo trekking in the Cascades. They'd mentioned the recent disappearances. 3 in the past month, all solo hikers, all found wandering days later with no memory of what happened. But I had my father's bandana tied around my wrist, and somehow that made me feel invincible. That was my first mistake. The morning started clear, with that crisp autumn air that makes everything seem more alive. I'd filed my hiking plan properly, documented my intended route, and carried all the recommended safety equipment. The legal requirements for solo hiking in national parks had become stricter since the disappearances began. I had 3 different GPS devices, emergency beacons, and enough supplies to last a week. The rangers had my complete itinerary, and I'd signed all the necessary waivers. Everything was by the book. The bandana had been my father's lucky charm for 20 years of mountain climbing. He'd worn it on every expedition, claiming it guided him through the worst storms and the most treacherous paths. When they found his body last year, the bandana was missing. It showed up on my doorstep 3 months later, neatly folded in a plain brown envelope with no return address. The police investigation went nowhere. No fingerprints, no DNA, no leads. Just a weather-worn piece of red fabric that smelled of pine needles and something else I couldn't quite identify. The first sign that something was wrong came around noon. My GPS devices started showing different locations, each one placing me miles apart from the others. The trail markers didn't match my map, and the sun seemed to be in the wrong position for that time of day. I felt a familiar sensation, the weight of unseen eyes tracking my movements. As a counselor specializing in stalking victims, I recognized the psychological impact of feeling watched, the racing heart, the hypervigilance, the way every shadow seemed to hold a threat. That's when I noticed the bandana had changed position on my wrist. I distinctly remembered tying it with the knot facing up, but now it faced down. A small detail, perhaps, but one that sent a chill down my spine. The fabric felt warmer than it should have, almost pulsing against my skin. I'd read studies about spirit attachment to objects, about how personal items could retain energy or memories from their previous owners. I'd always dismissed such theories as pseudoscience. Now, standing alone on a trail that seemed to be shifting before my eyes. I wasn't so sure. The legal framework for missing persons in national parks is complex, involving multiple jurisdictions and agencies. I'd studied these laws extensively after my father's death, looking for loopholes or oversights that might explain why the investigation had been closed so quickly. The official report cited natural causes: exposure, disorientation, a simple accident. But they never explained the strange symbols found carved into trees near his body, or why his compass had been crushed into a perfect sphere, or why the bandana had disappeared only to return months later. As afternoon faded into evening, the trail began to change. Not gradually like normal terrain shifts, but suddenly and completely. I would blink and find myself in a different section of forest, though my GPS devices still couldn't agree on where I was. The bandana grew warmer, and I swore I could feel it tightening and loosening rhythmically like a pulse. The psychological impact of isolation in wilderness areas is well documented, but this felt different. It felt deliberate. The first footprints appeared just as I was considering making camp. They emerged from nowhere, clear boot prints in soil that had been empty moments before. They were my father's size, leading off the trail into dense undergrowth. The bandana pulled tight against my wrist, almost painfully hot now. Every logical part of my mind screamed to stay on the marked trail, to follow basic survival protocols. But the pull was irresistible, as if the bandana itself was guiding me towards something I needed to see. Legal protection means nothing when you're following ghost footprints through an impossible forest. My satellite phone showed no signal, though I was certain I'd had full coverage minutes earlier. The emergency beacon emitted no light when I pressed it, though I tested it that morning. The trees seemed to grow denser with each step, their branches reaching down like grasping hands. The psychological strain of knowing you're walking into danger but being unable to stop is unique, a special kind of horror that exists in the space between compulsion and choice. The clearing appeared suddenly, as if it had been waiting for me. Perfect circle, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by trees marked with the same strange symbols found near my father's body. In the center stood a single post, not wood, not metal, but something that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The bandana burned against my skin, and for the first time, I noticed that its color had deepened, becoming the rich red of fresh blood. Legal documents can't explain what happened next. Psychological theories fall short. The post began to hum, a deep vibration that I felt in my bones. The bandana unwound itself from my wrist, floating through the air like a crimson snake. As it touched the post, the humming grew louder, and the air itself seemed to tear open. Through that tear, I saw my father, not as he was when they found him, but as he had been that day on the mountain, alive, climbing, wearing the same red bandana. He turned toward me, his face a mask of terror, and I understood. The bandana hadn't been guiding him. It had been hunting him. The psychological impact of realizing you're holding a cursed object is profound. Everything I knew about stalking victims suddenly applied to myself. The helplessness, the violation of personal space, the knowledge that something malevolent had chosen you. The bandana had been following my family for years, passing from victim to victim, leading each of us to this clearing, to this moment of revelation. They found me 3 days later, huddled in a cave 5 miles from my last known position. The legal proceedings that followed were confusing and ultimately inconclusive. How do you explain to park rangers and police that a piece of fabric led you through an impossible forest? How do you describe a tear in reality that showed you your father's last moments? The psychological evaluation suggested trauma-induced hallucination, but they couldn't explain the perfect circle of burns around my wrist where the bandana had been. The investigation into the other disappearances continues, but I know they won't find anything. The bandana is gone now, probably seeking its next victim. The legal system isn't equipped to handle supernatural stalkers, and psychological theory can't explain objects that hunt across generations. Sometimes at night, I dream of that clearing, of the post that wasn't quite solid, of my father's face as he realized what was happening. I wake with the smell of pine needles in my nose and the sensation of fabric tightening around my wrist. The official report lists me as another victim of wilderness disorientation, just like my father. The legal documentation is perfect. Every form filed, every procedure followed, every box checked. But the truth lies in the things they couldn't document. The way the bandana moved on its own, the impossible forest that existed between known locations, the tear in reality that showed me the truth about my father's death, the psychological impact of surviving something that shouldn't exist is complex. You learn to doubt everything. Your memories, your senses, your understanding of how the world works, but you also learn to recognize the signs. Since my experience, I've documented 3 cases of similar objects: a watch, a compass, and a hiking boot. All belong to people who disappeared in national parks. All returned mysteriously months later. All seem to carry their own warmth. I've started a support group, operating just on the edge of legal recognition. We meet monthly to share our stories, to compare notes on objects that hunt and forests that shift. The psychological establishment dismisses us as trauma victims sharing mass delusions. The legal system has no framework for what we've experienced, but we know the truth. We've all felt that unnatural warmth, seen those impossible clearings, witnessed tears in the fabric of reality. Sometimes I think I see the bandana, a flash of red in a crowd, a familiar warmth on my wrist, the smell of pine needles where there should be none. The legal authorities assure me it was destroyed, but I know better. You can't destroy something that isn't quite real to begin with. It's out there somewhere, being passed from hand to hand, waiting for the right moment to begin its hunt again. The psychological literature suggests that trauma survivors often create narratives to make sense of their experiences. But some experiences defy narrative. Some horrors exist in the spaces between what we can explain and what we can only witness. The red bandana taught me that. And somewhere in an impossible forest, in a clearing that appears only when it hunts, another tear in reality is opening, showing another victim their final truth. My father's last words, scrawled in his journal but redacted from the official report, haunt me still. It's not following me anymore. It's leading me somewhere. I have to know where. Now, I understand what he meant. The bandana wasn't just an object with an attached spirit. It was a lure, a tool used by something older and hungrier than any ghost. And it's still out there, still hunting, still leading people into forests that shouldn't exist, showing them truths they were never meant to see.
The vintage camping stove shouldn't have been there. sitting perfectly preserved in the middle of the Mojave Desert. My GPS showed we were miles from any established campsite or trail, and the surrounding sand held no footprints except our own. The scratched aluminum surface gleamed under the merciless sun, its 1970s design a stark contrast to our modern ultralight gear. Melissa wanted to leave it alone, but I couldn't resist. As a collector of vintage outdoor equipment, I recognized it as a rare model. The detective in me wondered about its history. The legal implications of abandoned property in national parks were complex, but something about this stove felt wrong, felt personal. The ranger's warnings about the recent disappearances echoed in my mind as I packed the stove into my backpack. 3 solo hikers had vanished in the past month alone, only to reappear weeks later at different locations across the desert. Their stories made no sense. Tales of being followed by something that left no tracks, of camping gear that moved on its own, of nights that stretched into impossible lengths. The psychological evaluations had dismissed their accounts as dehydration-induced hallucinations, but I'd investigated enough stalking cases in my career as a detective to recognize genuine trauma when I saw it. That first night, we made camp in a natural depression between 2 rock formations. The legal permits for overnight camping in this area required detailed documentation of our location, which I dutifully recorded on my satellite phone. Melissa set up our modern camp stove, but it wouldn't light despite being fully fueled. The vintage stove, however, burst into life at the slightest touch, its blue flame steady and strong despite having no visible fuel source. The coffee we made on it tasted of decades past, of other camps, of stories untold. The psychological impact of isolation in the desert is well documented, but nothing had prepared us for what happened that night. The temperature dropped far below normal for the season, our breath visible in the frigid air. The vintage stove continued to burn without fuel, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of the flame. We heard footsteps circling our tent, not the sound of animal paws on sand, but distinct human footsteps, accompanied by the metallic clinking of old camping gear. By morning, our modern equipment had been rearranged. Not randomly, but in a perfect circle around the vintage stove. The GPS devices showed impossible coordinates, locations that would have placed us simultaneously in different parts of the desert. The legal framework for filing missing persons reports flashed through my mind. I'd helped write some of the protocols after the recent disappearances. Now I wondered if we'd stumbled upon the reason those hikers had vanished, if this innocent-looking piece of camping equipment was somehow connected. The trail we'd followed had vanished, replaced by unfamiliar terrain that matched no topographical map. Our satellite phone showed no signal, though we had full coverage the day before. The vintage stove grew warm in my pack without being lit, pulsing like a heartbeat against my back. Melissa, a psychologist specializing in stalking victims, recognized the signs of being watched. The constant tension, the feeling of eyes tracking our every move, the way the desert itself seemed to shift when we weren't looking directly at it. Legal protection means nothing when reality itself begins to unravel. The sun hadn't moved in hours, hanging fixed in the sky like a spotlight. The vintage stove grew hotter, and I swore I could hear voices emanating from it. Snippets of conversations from other camps, screams cut short, prayers whispered in desperation. The psychological strain of knowing something impossible was happening, yet being unable to deny it, began to take its toll. That's when we found the first campsite. It appeared suddenly behind a dune that hadn't been there moments before, a perfectly preserved scene from what looked like the 1970s. Empty sleeping bags arranged around a stove identical to the one in my pack, coffee cups still half full, personal belongings scattered as if their owners had vanished in the middle of breakfast. The date on a newspaper among the artifacts matched the manufacturing date of our vintage stove, June 15, 1973. The psychological impact of realizing you're dealing with something supernatural is profound. All my years of detective work, of following logical evidence trails and legal procedures, seemed meaningless in the face of what we were experiencing. Melissa's professional understanding of stalking behavior offered no framework for an entity that seemed to exist outside of time itself, that used abandoned camping gear as anchors to our reality. More campsites began to appear, each from a different era, each featuring the same model of stove. Some showed signs of struggle, others looked peacefully abandoned. All felt wrong in a way that defied explanation. The stove in my pack burned hotter with each discovery, and the voices growing clearer, conversations overlapping across decades, all ending in the same abrupt silence. The legal consequences of what happened next would never be filed in any official report. The vintage stove began to glow with an inner light, its metal surface rippling like water. The other stoves in the abandoned campsites responded, creating a network of pulsing light across the desert. The air between them seemed to tear, revealing glimpses of other times, other hikers, other moments of terror and realization. Melissa's psychological training helped us understand what we were seeing. Not just haunted objects, but temporal anchors, points where something had broken through from elsewhere. The stoves weren't just collecting places or abandoned gear. They were collecting people, collecting moments, collecting fear. Each one was a door, and we had unknowingly carried a key into this maze of lost time. The official search for us began 36 hours after we missed our second check-in. The legal machinery of desert rescue operations spun into motion: helicopters, ground teams, infrared sensors. They found nothing because we weren't just lost in space, we were lost in time. The vintage stove had led us into a pocket of collapsed moments, where all the disappearances across decades were happening simultaneously. We survived because Melissa recognized the pattern. As a psychologist, she understood that even supernatural stalkers followed certain behaviors. The stoves weren't randomly placed, they formed a pattern, a ritual repeated across time. By tracking the timestamps of each campsite, we found a way to predict where the next tear would appear. The legal documentation of previous disappearances provided the final clue. They all occurred during specific lunar phases. When they found us 3 days later, we were sitting calmly at a ranger station 50 miles from our last known location. The legal paperwork listed us as another case of desert disorientation, despite our professional backgrounds and experience. The psychological evaluation suggested shared delusion triggered by extreme conditions. They couldn't explain our vintage stove, now cold and normal, or the identical stoves that began appearing at ranger stations across the desert, each tied to a different disappearance. The psychological impact of surviving something that exists outside normal experience changes you. Melissa and I now run a support group for others who've encountered similar phenomena. People who found ordinary objects that serve as doorways to extraordinary horrors. The legal system doesn't recognize our experiences, but we document everything, building a framework for understanding these incidents. Some truths exist beyond legal protection, beyond psychological explanation. The vintage stove sits in a secured evidence locker now, but sometimes late at night, I swear I can hear it calling. Somewhere in the desert, another piece of camping gear is waiting to be found, ready to lead new victims into that maze of lost moments. The legal framework for dealing with haunted objects doesn't exist, but the horror they create is real. More campsites appear each year, perfect snapshots of moments frozen in time. Rangers document them, archaeologists study them, lawyers debate jurisdiction over impossible findings. But those of us who know the truth recognize them for what they are, not just abandoned camps, but markers of where reality has been torn, where something reaches through common objects to stalk across time itself. The psychological literature talks about closure, about processing trauma through understanding. But some experiences defy understanding. The vintage stove taught us that the line between lost and found isn't always clear, that time isn't always linear, and that some stalkers don't just follow you through space, they follow you through time itself, collecting moments of terror like precious artifacts.